Good morning, Internet. This is Andrew.
And Matthew again.
We've already been to Elfland and back, but where will we be going next? Matthew, perhaps you can enlighten us.
Oh, well, it's a bit of a conventional destination and a mainstream one at that. We're exploring Middle Earth today, and I have some opinions on that whole thing, but I read all three Lord of the Rings books quite a while ago on my Nook, back when I downloaded for free on this one site I don't remember. I have,
Sketch.
my Nook is still running, AB.
Fair.
So, yeah, I read through that, and then I might have actually watched the movies first, and that got me started on, like, a reading craze and on my fantasy reading craze, actually. So, and then I read the Silmarillion, and before all that, actually, I read The Hobbit, like, 5 times in my life, or something crazy like that. And you know how excited I was for the movies when they came out, right?
Yes, I do remember that.
And that actually got me connected with J.G. Keely indirectly, because I started reading Titus Groan and Gorman Goss by Mervyn Peake, and then I found his review of those books. And then I read his review on Titus Groan. So he had a interesting review on Lord of the Rings. He gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and if you're not familiar with his rating system, basically means that there's, like, 1 star is like there's no spelling errors and stuff. 2 is like there has original concepts or something, or the characterization makes sense. 3rd is psychological realism. 4th is exploration of psychology, and 5th is exploration of philosophy. No, actually no. Third is psychological realism. 4th is philosophy, and 5th is unique writing style. And so he gave it a 3. And he had a lot of interesting thoughts. One of them was there's sort of this feeling in fantasy fandoms and among literary circles that, like, Tolkien is like the granddad of fantasy. Like, he invented elves and all this stuff and fictional worlds and world building. It turns out he really didn't. And the more that I read, like, some of J.G. Keely's recommendations and a lot of the stuff that really inspired Tolkien, like Lord Dunsany and his King of Elfland's Daughter, or Edison, not spelled like Thomas Edison, with his The Worm Ouroboros. That, they had things like, and even, like, stuff that's more modern that kind of has the same elements, I think, did better, like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So I'm not knocking world building here. Like, he didn't invent certain concepts, and then there are certain things that, like, books that came out, like, during when the Lord of the Rings came out as books that were shorter and, in my opinion, better and explored philosophy. Like, J.G. Keely's favorite example is The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson, which had, it was actually very similar to Lord of the Rings. It had to do with mythology and elves and swords and the Age of Men and all this sort of thing. And it has a lot of the same plot elements, too. He didn't invent fantasy. He explored similar ideas as other fantasists, but not philosophically. 2 things that J.G. Keely didn't like, and I kind of have to disagree with some things, that Tolkien was, like, the ultimate changeophobe. That as much as he denied later that a lot of things in his books kind of represented, like, his hatred of change, like Saruman and, like, the industrialization of England, that sort of thing, and England changing and becoming less rural. It kind of played into the stereotype called Merry England, which is kind of like this Victorian thing where they wanted, like, the best parts of the medieval era back, but they kind of sort of whitewashed it and made it look cool. Like, today it's, like, kind of the 1950s for, like, paleo conservatives and that kind of thing. Like, it's just this old manny changeophobic lack of, like, hatred of change. And as much as he did deny it for the Lord of the Rings, he did say that was a big theme in the Silmarillion. How that he was exploring the past, a fictional past, because he felt that it was lost through the suburbanization, Americanization of England in the 1950s after the World War II ended. So it is a theme in his novels, if not on Lord of the Rings. It is a theme in his work. So, and another things that A.G. Keely talked about, which I do agree with, that he turns things into a sort of moralization. Like, there's a very hard black and white good and evil, and there occasionally have characters who, like, rebel, or they're traitors, or you have someone like Gollum Smeagol, who's kind of like both. But what I don't like about it is, like, other books have taken, instead of good and evil take in two worldviews, like The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson. He has one side is an evil and a good. There's one side which is paganism, another side is Christianity, and he doesn't paint one or either good. They have them fight. That's for sure, and it's interesting, and it's battle scenes and all this cool kind of stuff. But he doesn't have like one side being good. And then Keely kind of goes too far and says this is kind of a racist ideal because if the orcs are evil, they're all a bad race, and that kind of reminded him of Victorian racism. I think he was going too far because I think he kind of read in a lot of SJW identity politics into it, and that he really shouldn't have. But I do think that that's not the best kind of attitude to have when writing those kind of things. Like, there are no good orcs in Lord of the Rings. If there are, I know they're artificial beings, but like he didn't know how like he handled it. Because as a work of fiction, you don't have to write fantasy races like that. There's no rule. And he felt that that was kind of two-dimensional writing anyway. So the last thing that he didn't like was a lot of the legacy of Tolkien is to like he kind of normalized very big volumes, like a sort of lack of editing. And there's like there's some terrible examples of like Santh. There's like 50 novels, like Shannara, like an uncountable enough, like the Wheel of Time. You can't even count them. And I'm not attacking.
The first 40 pages of Shannara are longer than the entire Lord of the Rings.
That's pretty bad. Well, you're talking about lordoms, right?
I'm talking about trying to read it. It has to be the most boring opening to a book I think I've ever read in my entire life. And that's saying something.
He's saying Tolkien kind of like, in a sense, like normalized that. I'm not attacking detail and fantasy. Like Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell, War Ouroboros, like they do that well, but like Keely feels like he went for a simulationist approach, and that he was a scholar of Tolkien. Like he was in Oxford and he knew languages, and he kind of shoehorned that scholarly dryness, that sort of English analyticism that I don't really see in Lord Dunsany. And I wonder if that's a cultural thing because like the Irish, as stereotypical as it may seem, like they kind of go for more like an emotional approach. Like I don't know if you ever read W.B. Yeats, but it's a very romanticist. Like they talk about nature.
Yeah.
I mean, like you also get like James Joyce, and it's like a dictionary. But that's like a very social. It's like a half Jewish, half Irish Jew going around Dublin. It's not about like fictional languages or anything. It's like a stream of consciousness thing. So it's very English, dry, academic attempt on fantasy that at the time was new. So that I would say is unique, like a scholar. But then I think people took that the wrong way, and I'll conclude with a kind of pessimistic point. A lot of the fantasy fandoms now, and I'm not saying all of them, a lot of them are around for good reasons, but too much in fandoms in general are about one-upmanship, about how many details in the universe you know. Like, or did Han shot first, or was his vest brown or yellow or blue in The Empire Strikes Back? And Keely in his criticism traces that back to Tolkien, that he was the start of the detail-oriented fantasy universes. Like, he started that bad meme. And honestly, I think he's kind of right. I mean, if that's your thing, fine, whatever, but I think he could have done it a better way. And that's all I'm going to say for now. He talked more about fantasy in general, but honestly, I think he was a bit, Keely was a bit nice, because people like China Miéville called Tolkien the Wen on the A word of fantasy literature. So he could have been much worse than much harsher language.
I could say what I think of China Miéville, but that's besides the point. All right, here we go. Time to be the devil's advocate.
Okay, fine.
Because that's what I'm not Keely, all the time.
You're hearing it not from the horse's mouth. So that's why I want like a link in the description of his reviews and his other writings.
Okay, first of all, I would say that whether or not Keely likes it, I think even though he tries not to say it, he does end up saying it. Because J.R.R. Tolkien is the father of modern fantasy. There was nothing like what he tried to do before him.
Well, he made it popular, and that's debatable. I
There
mean,
was
like you could
still
argue,
nothing like it, though. There's
you could.
nothing to the scale of Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion. There was nothing like it that came before.
I would
And as
argue
of
no,
yet,
because
there's
of Paul
nothing that's
Anderson.
achieved what it's achieved since.
Well, I'd say in terms of popularity, yes, but even then, I would think maybe Harry Potter just in book sales, like, and the fact that like I think like it made fantasy popular. Like after the Lord of the Rings came out in England, it came out in America, and then you had all the Ballantine classic fantasies that came out in the late '60s, and one of the reprints was like Lord Dunsea's King of Elfland's Daughter, and then it had an audience because people knew what the Lord of the Rings was, and the same could think about like video games and movies and stuff. So I will credit for that.
Okay, I would um I would say that when you're actually reading the writings of Tolkien, the his language skills were not shoehorned in. In fact, his creation of the Elven tongue was a mental exercise that sprung out into Middle Earth. It
Okay.
started with the Elven language, not the other way around.
He wasn't first though. If you read War More Boris, that had fictional languages in it.
Oh, I'm sure he's not the first person to make up a fictional tongue. I mean, like for Pete's sake, we had Pig Latin before that.
No, I meant in fantasy because you had Edison in the War More
Oh,
Boris.
I know, and I think that
He was inspired by him too. I think he like directly said in his letters, like his like letter books. He might have just like said that. He mentioned King of Elfland's Daughter too.
uh, I mean, those are not in letters that I've read, so I can't speak directly to that. But it wouldn't surprise me because, to be perfectly frank, I see the same thing in the King of Elfland's Daughter, which is also, whether or not you like to admit, it's not freakishly lore oriented, but it is freakishly detailed oriented. Sometimes ad nauseum. It's beautiful, but there are some times where I'm reading 3.5 pages of description,
And honestly,
and
I didn't like that either. But I just like his approach better. I think he like his the entire thing with Orion chasing the unicorn. That was way too much, honestly. But
really, really Orion chasing the unicorn was one of my favorite parts.
oh,
We don't agree
sorry,
about much, do we?
no. But no,
Um,
I agree with you on the main point though.
yeah, so I understand where the detail is from, and the way I think Tolkien writes it in a very charming way. You're right, there is that sort of that Albion feeling when he's shooting for Albion. He wants to have an idealized mythology of a Britain that was.
Yes, he's very English. He's a very English writer.
And see, because he's an Englishman, I don't think there's a problem with that. Like if that's why I think a lot of the later books that have come after, particularly from America, and have tried to do the same thing, it doesn't work because they are Americans trying to copy the style of
Yes.
somebody who was trying to make Albion's national myth. And that's why I think it falls short. So I have no problem with him trying to
Yeah,
do
it's just
that.
Keely's problem. Like the only problem I could see is like it was very, and it wasn't. England was imperialist at the time. They were basically like European Japanese, and they did, and along with some of the cruel methods too. Like you sought to make people English in a cultural way by guns. Like even like in a almost innocent way. Like C.S. Lewis kind of that went that way. Like he went from like this Irish dude who was I think Protestant before. Like if you read C.S. Lewis, he's much more English than he is Irish. I didn't know forever C.S. Lewis was Irish.
He
Like
is part
forever.
Irish, yes.
Like he was friends with Tolkien and he made him English in a large way, like including converting him to Christianity or convincing him of it. And I'm not really a fan of C.S. Lewis anymore. I'm a huge fan of J.T. Chesterton, who's very English, but I just think that he kind of like I feel like he wanted to make things English. And as you know, like the British hate the French, and back during the Victorian period, they hated the Irish and the Indians and the Nigerians. And, yeah, it was ugly. I guess that's what Keely is saying. It's like targeting back to a more backwards era, and you see that in the orcs.
But you are correct in saying that the orcs are a synthetic race. They're a
Yeah,
manufactured race. They
but
are not a they're not a distinctive people.
but Keely might fire back that that's Tolkien's way of being lazy and possibly racist. That he kind of made like a drone race on purpose to get around characterization. He made an army of Mary Stews, or evil Mary Stews, if you will.
That's not true because the orcs are shown as the opposite of the elves. They are shown as corruption that is created. And the one thing I think is first of all, his point scale, how he grades things, is from a literary perspective, from a literary student, from somebody who studies literature. It has got to be the most idiotic thing I've ever heard of. I mean, this is. Does he get paid to do criticism?
No, he's like a random. No, he's like the 79th most popular reviewer on Goodreads.
My criticism of the scale is saying, one, it ignores the art, it ignores the story, it ignores any deeper meaning. Because as far as he is concerned, there's no such thing as an overarching theme or a basis. There is only what the characters are capable of, and that means you're going for an entirely character-driven story, which is a modern conception. I think the character-driven story is a fairly modern conception. And in The Lord of the Rings, the disconnect is here because it is not character-driven, nor is it intended to be. The characters are pieces in an overarching story. They are driven along by the story, not by their own personalities or necessarily even their own motivations.
Are you saying the created world is unique? The created world is unique?
Unto Tolkien itself, yes, there was nothing quite like it made before or since, but people have tried to copy it since. Or take
I don't know about that
since.
because, like, it was sort of I would read The Broken Sword and The Warmer Ouroboros because they have pretty similar created worlds. I mean, like, they're not. If you mean by scale, like length, no, because Broken Sword is about less than 300 and Warmer Ouroboros is less than 400. Again, like, it depends on, like, how do you define scale?
I'm defining scale in the... That's actually a fair question, because when I'm thinking scale, I'm thinking of the... What's the word I'm looking for? It's the, not the girth. I'm talking about the sweep of the story. How big the sweep of the story is. Like, I'm saying that Tolkien is very high fantasy.
And I would say that's not unique either, because if you like want battles and nations and all that stuff, like you get that in The Broken Sword, same year came out as Fellowship of the Ring, and then you have Warmer Ouroboros that came out in 1922 or 4. So, I mean, you haven't read this yet, so like I want you to read them before giving your opinion. I have it on ebook, and I can't really it doesn't have like lend me technology, but like I would, like I hate to say it, but like I'm kind of like arguing from knowledge just because I read those books. Like, you come back to me on that, though.
I will get back to you once I have a chance to read those two.
I had The Broken Sword as a physical copy, so...
True, but I still think there's a reason that Tolkien inhabits such a historical place, not just by his fandom, but also inside academia. There's a reason that academics look up to this book so much, and I feel like you touched on it by saying that's because it's a stuffy British fantasy, which I would disagree with it. I don't think there's anything necessarily when you compare it to like The King of Elfland's Daughter. Yeah, there is definitely a more staid approach to the world. There isn't the same sort of...
Yeah, I just don't think Dunsany and Tolkien are really comparable. I think the ones you want to compare to are Edison and Anderson. Because they also, to be fair, they also had more of a Norse mythology than a English mythology, and also Anderson kind of has a little bit of Irish mythology at the very end, and Dunsany he's pretty much Irish, but he has a lot of English thought in that too. So kind of apples to oranges there.
True.
But I don't know.
Well, the comparison was just to say that if you do try to compare the two, that there is a sort of wild beauty compared to an intentionally crafted aesthetic beauty. And I would also like to say that the entire work, the entire exercise of The Lord of the Rings and the surrounding books, they are a philosophical exercise. They are a work. They are a work of Christian Platonism.
As an pure experiment, I guess so. I mean, like,
I mean, just not even as an experiment, as a journey. That and the works of C.S. Lewis, they are an outflowing of Western Christian Platonism, which is basically that is the foundation of. I would say, at least I would say it's the foundation of the creative prowess of the high church that we saw in that era, and
that's pretty Catholic. I mean, like,
it is
like having the Catholic approach to art that, like, we could spend this money on missions, but we chose to spend it on making art on Europe, and
that is a more past age.
Point. And G.K. Chesterton actually talked about that.
Right, but but the one thing is, once you start getting into the more Catholic side, you do have to start dealing with Aristotle, who is problematic both towards fantasy and just towards the act of fiction and art in general.
But if you think about, like, Protestant versus Catholicism, like, the point of life is to save souls by doing good, by doing work, so that, like, making a work of art, and if it is good, maybe, you know, who knows, maybe that's another year out of purgatory, you know? And, like, opposed to, like, Protestantism, like, there's, like, it depends on, like, the instant, you know, like, you can be saved, like, get saved at any time, and, like, you maybe want to have, like, that's why you had, like, primitivism in the Protestant church, you know, like, you had more of a, but without, like, being monastic about it either, you know, like, maybe, like, you kind of see, like, and that kind of is English Protestant in its own way. I don't know how to sum this up in a way, but, like, English Protestantism as a culture and Calvinist, and into a certain extent French Calvinism, they kind of lived in a very, like, Spartan way without being, and sometimes went into monasticism. I'd say that the Protestant church is very monastic in that in its laziness. And, like, if you look at, like,
are laziness and monasticism the same thing, though?
Well, monasticism is like choosing to learn about the Word of God rather than choosing to spread the gospel. Even though I know that's, like, not the classic definition, but that's how I see it today.
I know, you saw my face, because today I'm not sure, you might be right, because my thing was thinking, the way I thought of it was a cleansing, a separation from the world, as a way to try and preserve the world. But you know, and by one other point about the about the Lord of the Rings would be that because of what it is, I think it's inherently philosophical. And I'm sorry, I never got to say why the writing skill was idiotic. Idiotic is probably too strong a word. Massively problematic, because one, you're giving a book only two ends. You're giving a book two ends. One, it explores psychology.
Well, really five. Like, yeah, really five, but, like...
But what five?
Like, no grammatical errors, or, like, it make... Second is psychological realism. Third is exploring philosophy. Fourth is exploring psychology, or strike that reverse end. Fifth is unique writing style.
If it is okay, so not philosophy. So, one, a unique writing style is...
That would be like Herman Melville or John Milton.
Well, right, but then you are only ascribing a singular writing style to a one person. Everybody inherently writes unique, even though developing
what Keely would argue was that you go through a like. See, this would be easier if you read Mervyn Peake and Titus Grown. Like, the way he would be, like, the ultimate example. Like, you go through perception. You understand how perception works, and you use that to describe something precisely. It's all about perception. And if you read Mervyn Peake, I would, like, say, like, that is what I mean. Like, something along those lines. Like, you can get there different ways, but they all aim for this certain thing, and it's about preciseness of perception. But that's a very vague TLDR explanation. I think Keely explains this more, and I don't have any notes for that.
Well, anyways, I was going to say...
That's why usually philosophy and psychology are kind of, like, both explored together in the best novels I read from Keely recommendations, because they do deal with human limits. They had to do with the ergo sum or however it's pronounced, of Descartes. The limits of consciousness and the nature of consciousness.
Okay, there we go. Now I have three things that I want to say. First is that actually makes more sense now, because the scale makes more sense in that context, because in that case, there's absolutely no reason why he should like The Lord of the Rings. Why? Because you aren't the centerpiece, you aren't even all that important. You're just a part of you're a cog in a greater world.
Yeah, it's like The Mysterious Stranger. You're but a thought, a lonely thought that travels the universe. Do you ever read Mark Twain, Mysterious Stranger?
I never read that Mark Twain, but I have read other Mark Twains. I've read quite a bit of Mark Twain.
It's trying to be simulationist, and yes, it's too. Yeah, it might. You mean like collectivism, or what? What do you mean?
What? No, all I'm saying is that it makes sense, because if I'm saying is when humans, if a human and human accomplishment is not the center of the story, then it seems like it would not fulfill his goal for the premise, for the human limit, for the human goal. It's a very modernist view, which is something that I inherently would disagree with. But now that I know that makes more sense to me. The second thing, when talking about the goals, and the thing is, you're also trying to, when you're saying everybody writes uniquely to themselves, but the thing is, I do think that is something about a book, which is when you read it, and without naming a character or a distinctive place, if you can know what book it came from, then I would say that's when it's achieved its own writing style. When you read a passage and you know who wrote it and in what book, I do think is worthy of a 4 or 5 star.
It's relative to psychology and consciousness. That is a good point.
How though?
But I would think that it's kind of like the difference between, you don't know movies very well, but the difference between Orson Welles and Tim Burton. Tim Burton, you might know his movies by what he talks about. Like outcasts and witches and drabness and goth emo stuff. But Orson Welles, you know by the way he uses lighting and stuff. You don't recognize the value, but what he uses, but instead how he uses it. So you might not recognize a Tolkien book by how he uses fictional races and stuff, but how he uses words and how he uses to describe everyday objects. And Mervyn Peake and Titus Groan, again, if you read him, you would understand what I'm talking about more. He just describes everyday things. There's no magic in Titus Groan. There's no supernatural anything. And J.G. Keely is okay with magic and things, but here, it's everyday things described fantastically, and I can't really describe that with you without you reading that book.
I understand the concept of everyday things described fantastically. It's not the only book that's ever done that, but I am interested in it. The fact that there's no supernatural in it as a fantasy does it acts as a bit of a turnoff for me, because anyway. Carry on.
Oh, that's fine. To me, it's so fantastical, and the castle and the people are so interesting that he doesn't need to use magic as a crutch. And I know, I'm not saying everyone uses magic as a crutch, even as a crutch. I don't need to talk about plot devices and plot convenience. To make the book interesting in and of itself. If I don't have magic, it will not be interesting. He manages to have a fantastical novel, not so much a fantasy novel, without having magic. He makes it's hard to explain. It really is its own thing. He's probably the most unique voice in the English language. Or at least up there with Shakespeare.
Bold claim. I feel like Shakespeare's on a plateau of his own.
Okay, but maybe their plateaus are of equal height. What I'm saying.
Bold claim. We can have a show about that later.
You need to read Titus Groan first, buddy.
No,
bring it on.
We have to do a show about that later. Meanwhile, I'm trying to save the English language. Um,
Yeah, by reading the Silmarillion.
which is honestly that book is what Tolkien is able to do with. Basically, he turns not Edith Wharton, the lady who wrote mythology. Her name's escaping me. Edith something. It's just not entering my head. That's a great book. Anybody who writes or reads anything should buy Mythology by Edith What's Her Face. It's a fantastic book.
He is knowledgeable about mythology, I will say that.
Um, it's just a fantastic book. But I think the way that Tolkien constructs the mythology for his own world is very moving. It's intensely emotive and emotional, and I'm in love with it. And the third thing that I would say is, you're right, it does have a tend to get simulationist, which is a problem, but it's also something that I'm okay with because, you know what, I think it's very charming the way we learn what happens to the horses when the heroes leave. It's a bright spot in what's an overwhelmingly dark place in the book. So I think I actually liked how he put it in there. Was it necessary? No, it wasn't necessary. But if you're only writing what's necessary, then you would only have the instruction manual for a refrigerator. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I certainly suspect we'll come back to this at a later date. But
this kind of goes into a discussion about like how we rate
yes.
fiction in general, like what our standards are for what makes fiction great. Because and I do believe in greater and lesser fiction.
I do as well.
I mean, in my own way, but like I want to know what you think about that.
I do.
First.
Oh, right, and I had one more point about magic. The point about magic is, I agree with you. Magic is very often a crutch for fantasy authors. Yeah. I can't get out of this. Magic. I think you can only truly have a excellent fantasy with magic if magic is part of the world and how it exists. All right, so on to our descriptions of great fantasy. I'll let you go first again.
Well, great fiction.
Oh, great! I'm sorry, great fiction. You're right. It's not just fantasy.
How about you first, because I got a lot of notes. I got like 4 pages of notes.
Holy crap! Okay, I have a bullet-pointed 8-point list. This is something I've actually we talked about at length in some of my classes, in some of my literature classes. We have talked at length and debated. But this actually came up in children. I was in a children's fiction class, which was one of the hardest and most frustrating, but also one of the most rewarding things I've ever done.
Okay.
But so we talked a lot about what does fiction mean? What is it? So I came up with basically an 8 list. This may be very similar to other lists, but I'd say number 1, it must speak beyond its time. 2,
that's a good point.
It must speak to a need or question in the human soul.
That makes sense too. It must be essentially necessary.
Mm-hmm. 3, it must be loved, not admired, but loved by a plurality of people who have read it. 4, it must both appeal and speak to both critics and the layperson. 5, it must say what it means to say in a fashion that it can be felt or discerned by those that read it. 6, it must leave the reader with a lasting feeling, thought, or conception beyond the characters and plot. 7, it must endure in popularity and reputation beyond its own era. And 8, it must say something true and or beautiful.
A bit vague, but I know what you're trying to say.
It's very hard. It's I think if you get too direct with it, you can start to cut out things that shouldn't be cut out.
Well, when you start getting direct, the more direct you get, you start writing the actual thing.
Interesting. You're seeing it from a writing perspective.
Okay.
That's interesting. Okay. I would like to hear your 4 pages of notes.
Okay,
Brace yourself, fans.
A lot of it was a vendetta about my postmodern teacher.
Oh, boy!
Yeah, they're great, and I'm gonna, beat the crap out of them. So...
Metaphorically, not literally, please, if you know any hardcore postmodernists, please do not harm them in any way, shape, or form, other than nuking their terrible conception of literature and the world.
So yeah, like I had was just to write about anything. It was a research paper. I said mine was, and my logline was what makes fantasy great. Great. What makes fantasy? You know what I'm saying, right? What makes
What makes
certain fantasy great and certain not? Certain.
what is the delineation between
Yes.
between great works and
Yeah.
the rest?
And they took all their loglines, wrote them down on a chalkboard, and they had to stop the whole class to say that, hey, like, Matt, don't say great because that's a matter of relative preference. That isn't scientific. And they wrote all these notes, like, stop. And I kept on insisting using the word great. And they said, that's just a matter of relative preference. You know, you need to learn cultural relativism because everything's equal. Everybody wins. There are no truths. There's only perspectives. Of course, if I came in to their class and had a swastika shirt and with holding a Mein Kampf, they wouldn't respect that culture, but and would say that culture was equal to, you know, even a culture they might like that's more extreme of equality, or the Soviet Union, or even Hong Kong or United States.
You have a point. There is something that makes Nazi Germany is objectively worse than, I don't know, our culture right now. It's
Yeah,
objectively worse. But once you get into more moral and cultural relativism, you cannot say that. You only think that Nazi Germany was worse than the culture of Nazi Germany was worse than we are now,
I mean,
that is that's the
you could go into
forever
social
inherent flaw.
science. You could go into you force you to go into social science, which isn't as well. I would actually argue it's more falsifiable from a pure consciousness perspective than like math, because consciousness isn't physical either. Because I can't falsify that you are conscious. Only I can
Right.
falsify that I'm
You
conscious.
can't necessarily like if you move further enough into relativism, you can't even prove that I'm real. I could
No, I
be a
can't.
figment of your
You
imagination.
could be a P zombie, what they call a P zombie. You
I
could be a robot, and but you could just but you know the Chinese room experiment. Like I can't prove that you are you.
I could be like what's the thing that he says in the Ebenezer Scrooge says in the Christmas Carol? I could swallow this toothpick and be haunted by a legion of goblins for the rest of my life. Like
Yeah,
I could be a bit of undigested cheese lodged in your lower intestine.
exactly. But you know that my teacher, you know, they're part of like everybody wins, and everybody's equal. Here's your participation trophy. You know, and
I'm glad I've never actually had a teacher because I have I have pretty
which is also
classical
ironic
teachers.
too, because they had this like grading rubric that they practically, I think they had like a little altar in the center of their like office where they bow down and worship to, which is a relative preference in its own way. So they're a total hypocrite. And but relative preferences are everywhere. Like, why am I wearing a green shirt? Relative preference. Why is like the air conditioner relative preference? They're unavoidable, but they're nothing to be afraid of.
I understand that is the inherent flaw whenever you remove the framework to build an objective structure, you are never going to be able to get it back.
Okay. And this number one thing I want to tear apart right now is that my idea of their certain works of fantasy are greater than others is not scientific. See, social science tells us that there's a whole field of social science that really goes into biology and neurobiology about the science of perception. And you can start with some basic things, like we can only see so far, we can only hear so far, that kind of thing. But like, if you look at Titus Grown, it's like it's indeed scientific. Like it has to do with human perception. And it's definitely falsifiable. There's research. I like someone called Jordan Pearson. He kind of works it's called the science of meaning making. You kind of understand that, right?
The science of meeting making?
Meaning making.
Meaning making, okay.
Yes. So, have you ever saw like the early 20th century painting that says basically in French, "This is not a pipe"?
I'm aware of it.
What is that trying to say?
That it's not a pipe?
But what is it really?
A pipe.
No, it's not. What is it?
Art.
Close. What is it? Has a picture of a pipe, but what is it not? It's not a pipe, but it is of a pipe.
A picture of a pipe.
It's a what of a pipe?
A picture of a pipe.
Of a representation of a pipe.
Okay.
It represents a thing. It's not the thing, it represents a thing.
Right.
All fiction is that pipe in a way. All fiction is a result of human perception in fiction and a representation of a reality, a symbol of meaning. Everything's a symbol. It's like Simulacrum Simulation, but that French guy. It's all fiction is a result of human perceptions. All fiction is fake. Representation of things we can see in consciousness.
I would disagree because I think that well, see, the interesting thing about fiction is it really fake? Because it is simply the perceptions of someone put onto a page.
Okay, but those things come from something, do they not?
Agree.
I mean, and even if logic and consciousness are the only things that can be known, that still means that fiction is a created thing from somewhere. I don't create like even if I wrote about abstract things, they had to come from somewhere, right?
Yes.
I had to base them off of something. Because everything is ultimately a combination of something, even their abstract concepts.
You're right. So an abstraction could be an extension of something that exists, yes.
And not all fiction does this well. Not all fiction is as precise as other fiction. Like I could just say there's a table. I'm resting my computer on a table, but I could say it's a brown table with 4 legs. That is a better use of language because it's more precise. So that is a better description than just saying a table exists, because it is better at fulfilling the task of preciseness. Is it not?
Yes, it is more precise, but it may not be accurate because I cannot confirm that. I can only see
but
let's
just say it was accurate. Then it would be also superior in another way, wouldn't it?
This is true.
So
if you're saying that fiction should tell you that the table is brown without showing you the table.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Like, if we're talking about fiction, it says something true, the table is brown, but it doesn't show you a picture of the table or present you with the table itself. It paints a picture of the table for you.
Yes, it describes through language.
But it may do it differently than you expect. It may do it in a different context. It may do it...
But it's a spectrum of preciseness that are better than just... And a lot of times it comes out for being lazy or not, how much work you put into the thing. I don't mean like writing it first time around, but just like the general working to that preciseness. So that, in a nutshell, that is like why I think that some of the books, for instance, J.G. Keely recommends, because they're more precise. They acknowledge that fiction is fake, and they use that to have a more precise description of the world and extract some odd little facet of human perception. And a lot of the other fantasy is like it's shorter and it's more precise than other fiction. And I mean, like, ultimately, I guess that my like, you don't have to side with my understanding of fiction, but I just think that it's, first of all, it is scientific because it deals with the social science, and in a way that's kind of meta-modernist in its own way, because, like, at least acknowledging free will, you don't have to side with my preferences, so they are relative in the sense you don't have to adopt them, but they definitely are scientific. Like, my teacher's full of crap that, like, they're not. They're absolutely scientific. Social science, yes. Mathematics, not so much, but that's not what I'm arguing.
Well, here's the thing, though, is I worry when you start to apply a science to an art. Because I think having objective standards within the study of an art is key. It's necessary. But the problem is when you start to intrinsically link science and art, if you pull Numenera and there's no inherent difference between magic and advanced technology, then you start to lose the art.
Okay, fair, but like, as much as social sciences aren't too much of a hard science, even though I consider scientific, what do these preferences say about me, since I chose those preferences? The books I like, as much as I like escapist material like Star Wars or Marvel movies, I like books that are like philosophically deep and psychologically accurate, because I consider I want to be knowledgeable. I want to be a knowledgeable person who is interesting, has interesting to talk about, and knows about the human condition. What do these preferences say about me? Why do I choose certain preferences? Why do I choose something that is more based on the social sciences than just like, this looks cool and that looks cool? Like, what does this say about me?
I think it would say that you want to know more. You want to go behind.
Yes, I want to go be like J.K. Chesterton in his book Man Who's Thursday. We got to get out in front.
I mean,
We
that
got
makes
to.
sense.
We're only seeing the back of everything. We need to go get out in front. And honestly, like there is a huge relative aspect um, of my standards, but I acknowledge it's relative. Is writing style like it's relative person to person, but if they go for preciseness and accuracy, and they like go towards it, then but they go to it in their own way. Like Mervyn Peake, John Milton, Shakespeare, they all have their own unique writing style, but they all went for the same thing. They all went for precise and accuracy and beauty, which ultimately beauty is probably the most relative thing. But we, from a Descartesian perspective, like we seem to always like acknowledge it. Like, you ever heard the experiment on Mary's color room?
Not by that name.
So in summary, it's supposed to teach that there are certain things that can only be saw and learned through consciousness. That if there's a colorblind person named Mary and she studied color all her life, like everything about color, like perceiving it, spectrums, everything, but one day she had her color blindness fixed and she saw the color red. Would she learn anything new? And if yes, then that makes me know that color is something that only consciousness can perceive of. It can't be given in information at any like amount. But at the same time, it's semi-scientific because you can convey information. But ultimately, if you were to describe me red, I couldn't know if you were talking about the same red because we were cut off by consciousness. And that has to go with the fact that I don't know if you really are conscious or not. I could be the only conscious being in the universe.
Hold on. Hold on. Let's try and bring this back to Earth for a sec. Okay. I mean, I'm following you. At least so far. I mean, it does make
Well, I stole everything from J.G. Keely, so I'm probably going to get sued for copyright now.
I don't think YouTube's that smart yet. So, well, that makes sense. Do you have like a list of just like a boom 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 list of what you figure the standard to be?
Yeah, but it basically comes back to the science of perception and like what does fiction do best and what does fiction do most uniquely.
Okay, well, do you want to move on to that list? Because I feel like we are starting to run
you mean
little...
Q&A time?
Well, is that pretty much?
That was it. That was my notes.
Okay, well in that case, that was fantastic, and now we are on to our Q&A time. So I will ask you first,
Right.
as you have made many references to J.G. Keely. Like, keep this brief, but how did you discover him, and what about him appeals to you the most? Like, why should our listeners care about what he has to say?
Well, I actually just found him after I read Titus Grown. I was poking around Goodreads and I just loved how he described things in his review. And I think maybe my favorite thing about him is, just in brief, that he applies research and erudite topics to speculative fiction and fiction reviewing in general that like no one else does. Like, he's just very knowledgeable, and that comes out in a couple ways. Especially like he has links to sources backing him up and other interesting points, and they're just like the best articles ever. Like, they're things you want to read. Like, sometimes I joke that I don't want to like read a J.G. Keely article because it's going to set me off of like a tangent of research, even to defend my own beliefs. Like, he had this article about Christianity, like attacking it. And he mentioned Bart Ehrman, and that launched me on reading at least like 3 books, like no kidding, about like Bart Ehrman and like defending like the historicity of the Bible, and like that's how good he is. Like that has kept me going to him time and time again.
All right, interesting. All right, and why should our people should care? Because he writes the best articles ever. Okay, you have a question for me.
Okay. I actually have it randomized.
Oh, I have it. You've it randomized. You put a lot of time into this. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, this is one of the more random ones. Favorite Scooby-Doo incarnation?
Wow. My favorite Scooby-Doo incarnation.
You have a fun one, in the most serious episode.
You have a fun one. I need to come up with more fun questions. Actually, my second question is a fun question.
Good.
Favorite Scooby-Doo incarnation? I'm gonna have to go with the original ones from the 60s.
No, that's fair. I wish that one was still playing, so to speak.
I do too. They were the most interesting ones. Even though I feel like once they hit sort of like the oddly enough, I feel like when they hit the Scooby-Doo, like when they were all children, I feel like they got the most character development out of that.
Yeah, me too. I don't know what's it. That was like the '80s one.
Not that it was good, but they got the most character development out of it.
That's true.
But I mean, I used to be obsessed with Scooby-Doo when I was younger.
I think I knew that. I used to have a really good video game from the early 2000s that for some reason I love, and I still kind of think it's cool today. And probably got rid of it.
It's probably terrible, but we probably loved. I had a Scooby-Doo game I loved. Then I came back to later, and I'm like, this is terrible. But I liked it when I was a kid.
Which one was it?
It was one for the Game Boy Advance. It was really hard.
Oh, I'm talking about a GameCube one. It's I just like the idea of going through a random mansion and playing by myself, and I don't know.
I think if you made a Scooby-Doo game well, I think it could be really cool. I'm thinking Luigi's Mansion Jr., but in the 60s.
Well, now I explore. I'm gonna say it I like exploring abandoned places, and I think that was
I know,
but I don't really like a horror element to that. I just I like architecture. I don't know. We got to do that this summer. I'm sorry, we got to escape from work and just go. I know some places.
Driving up to explore a dilapidated, abandoned crack house in northern Delaware.
I don't know. We'll see.
All right. It's time for my second question. My second question was fictional characters. Out of fictional characters, who were your 3 biggest crushes?
Oh, I knew this was coming. I really thought. Really, I was like, he's gonna ask that, isn't he? Really, I'm not kidding. I really thought that. Oh, it's hard to. Three entire. We're gonna be here all night.
Okay, well, if you can't think of 3, I will take 1. I will take 2.
Oh, I'm not thinking of any good right now.
America is clamoring. Possibly all of the rest of the British Empire that we offended a couple episodes ago was also clamoring. They want to know.
Nate, Gosh, I haven't played video games. No, I have played video games for a while.
We can come back to it. It's no big deal.
Okay.
Alright.
Was that only video game or anything?
Anything at all.
Oh.
Book characters. But, hey, we can come back to it.
Yeah.
Second question for me.
Okay. A movie better than its book.
Oh. That is a... Oy, that's a tough one. Trying to think of one. I might not be able to actually come up with one off the top of my head. That's one that I need to think about for a while, because I feel like there's one that I've seen, but there's not one that springs to mind as being like, oh yeah, that was a great movie, but his book wasn't that great. I'll get back to you on that one. Now we have 2 questions. Now we're gonna keep people with bated breath. So I think that's gonna wrap us up for this week. Tune in next week to hear us maybe talking about something less serious and less meta, and let us get into the epic questions that will now have us up late all week thinking about these answers. So anyway, for Behind the Curve, I am Andrew.
And Matthew.
Have a fantastic week, Internet, without us, until we see you again. And then it'll be so beautiful. If you care. I don't know if you care. This is probably going out to 3 people. But if you're those 3 people, we love you. Stay brave. Keep reading. Stay in school. Brush your teeth. Don't be unemployed just so you can read. Alright. See you guys later. Bye.